Welcome back, fellow scholars, to today's explainer. Now, since we're all pretty familiar with Nagarjuna's dialectic, we've already spent a ton of time digging into the first 11 chapters of the Mūlamadhyamakakārikā together. Today, we're actually going to take a bit of a step back. We need to look at the overarching architecture of this whole system. The goal here is to really map out the exact mechanics of the centerless karmic cycle. How we create it, how we get completely bound up in it, and ultimately, how we awaken from it. We're going to examine the precise cognitive glitches that trap us in this matrix of our own making, diagnosing the universal human condition with that calm, surgical precision that Madhyamaka absolutely demands.
Okay, let's dive right into our clinical roadmap for the day. We'll kick things off with the mechanics of creation, then move into the architecture of bondage. After that, we'll cover the Madhyamaka diagnostic, the union of the two truths, and finally wrap up with asymptotical awakening. Starting off with Section 1, the mechanics of creation, or how we hallucinate the boundaries.
So, to really grasp how we construct this reality of ours, we have to recognize a fundamental truth. The observer and the observed are constantly co-evolving, literally every infinitesimal moment. One conditions the other and vice versa. But here's the catch. Because we're biological creatures hardwired for survival, our visual cortex and our higher reasoning rely heavily on this mechanism of edge detection. Think about it. We have to be able to isolate a predator from the tall grass, right? Well, this deeply ingrained survival reflex essentially forces us to arbitrarily draw hard boundaries around tiny, isolated slices of the universe. The disease of reification is exactly this cognitive delusion. We take the inherently fluid, centerless, and completely interdependent flux of reality, and we mentally freeze it into solid, absolute, independent blocks. We are actively hallucinating a concrete reality where in truth there is only continuous process.
I really want you to sit with the profound cognitive dissonance of this next statement for a second. You are a verb masquerading as a noun. Literally everything you think of as solid, stable, or permanent, your identity, your daily problems, even the strict passage of time itself, it's all just an incredibly elaborate linguistic illusion. Let's kind of pop the hood and look at how this continuous, unbroken loop actually functions in real time. It always starts with edge detection, that biological isolation of a boundary within what is actually a seamless tapestry. Then comes reification. That's where we desperately try to freeze that fluid process into a static, solid object. And finally, conceptual imputation. In a fraction of a microsecond, the mind just slaps a linguistic label right onto that mirage. It's actually a lot like the biological phenomenon of saccadic masking. You know how our brains stitch together isolated visual frames to completely hide the blur of our eye movements? Well, our cognitive imputation does the exact same thing. It stitches together this fragmented, heavily edited version of reality and confidently tells us, yep, this is the absolute truth.
Moving right along to Section 2, the architecture of bondage and the fractal trap we find ourselves in.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core of our problem. Our minds simply cannot tolerate a centerless, flowing fractal. It's just way too overwhelming for us. So what do? We forcefully shove the seamless relational web of dependent origination into a highly rigid conceptual triad: the subject, the action, and the object. We take causality itself and slice it up into a producer, a production, and a product. And we don't just do this once. We relentlessly pile these triads on top of one another, over and over in this limitless, fractal way. As a result, our perceived world becomes exponentially more convoluted and paradoxical. This self-replicating conceptual maze, that is the very definition of samsara, a limitless, centerless, fractal karmic cycle.
Because of this deep-seated triadic delusion, we become hopelessly attached to our own models. We literally become slaves to them. We constantly prop up what the classical texts refer to as the invisible mannequin. We hallucinate this foundational core entity, and then we dress it up in the temporary clothing of properties like heat, extension, or solidity. And in doing so, we completely forget that we are the ones imputing the edges in the first place. We're generating immense psychological friction for ourselves because we are desperately trying to freeze the river of reality into solid blocks of ice just to have somewhere safe to stand, completely missing the fact that we are actually meant to be swimming in the karmic flow.
All right, let's look at the surgical cure in Section 3, the Madhyamaka diagnostic, exposing the absurdity. Now, as experts in this framework, you already know that the way out isn't to just run away from these concepts. No, the way out is to systematically expose their inherent contradiction. So, the crucial point is that we apply the 11-step universal reasoning to completely dismantle these triads. We feed their three spheres into the absolute rigor of the tetralemma stress test. And from the logical collapse that inevitably follows, we establish their complete emptiness of inherent existence, which is the second truth. Then, from that very emptiness, we seamlessly deduce their dependent origination, the first truth. And of course, this perfectly sets up the grand revelation, the union of the two truths.
Let's just briefly remind ourselves why every single corner of the tetralemma collapses when we try to look for an absolute foundation. If the spheres of a triad, say a cause and an effect, are inherently identical, well, the dynamic relational verb separating them just collapses into tautological absurdity. If they are entirely different and separate, then they're trapped in hermetically sealed metaphysical boxes, making any sort of interaction or causality totally impossible. Now, claiming they are both identical and different, that's just a direct logical contradiction, and claiming they are neither removes all conceptual or functional grounding whatsoever. So the inescapable conclusion here is that every single model, every duality, every triad we come up with is entirely ungraspable. It's totally empty of svabha, empty of any independent inherent essence.
Which brings us to section 4, the union of the two truths, or the mirage that functions. This is where we encounter the mirage that actually functions. Look, if you walk straight into a brick wall, that temporary aggregation of atoms is going to interact with your biology perfectly in accordance with classical physics. The pain, the potentially broken nose, those are undeniably conventionally real. They are highly functional. We absolutely have to respect the conventional truth. But ultimately, that wall is essentially an echo in a canyon. Yes, it functionally vibrates eardrums, it can startle the bird, it does things. But if you try to reach into the air to grab the absolute independent core of that echo, you aren't going to catch anything but empty air. The conventional broken nose is real precisely because the temporary aggregation of conditions is completely devoid of any ultimate substance.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that it induces a kind of profound diagnostic vertigo. Think about it. If we systematically remove every single conceptual floorboard beneath your feet, if the subject, the action, and the object are literally all just echoes, what is actually left? When there is absolutely zero absolute ground for you to grasp onto, what remains? Well, it's the realization of non-dual suchness, just resting in reality exactly as it is, totally free from those suffocating layers of absolute judgment and reification. And that leads us perfectly into section 5, asymptotical awakening, resting in suchness. You see, liberation in Madhyamaka isn't some magical escape pod to a totally different reality. It's about mastering the art of acting without acting, right here, right now, in the centerless flux. Because this is a fractal reality, awakening is not just a singular finite destination where you cross a finish line. It is an asymptotical, fractal deconstruction of progressively subtler and subtler assumptions, models, and triads that we've previously imagined. And here is perhaps the most crucial, almost esoteric warning Nagarjuna leaves us with. The cure itself is empty. Both dependent origination and emptiness are themselves dependently co-arisen. By preventing our minds from reifying the philosophical framework itself into some new absolute dogma, the conceptual boundary between samsara and nirvana completely dissolves into non-dual suchness. We learn how to act conventionally without ever acting in absolute terms. So, as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a final, highly practical challenge. I really want you to take this thought with you. The next time you feel completely overwhelmed by a rigid definition of who you are, or maybe an airtight assumption about a problem you're facing, ask yourself this. How much of your daily stress, your deep anxiety, and your suffering is simply the immense, exhausting friction of trying to forcefully freeze a fluid, centerless cycle? What would actually happen if you finally put down the heavy burden of that invisible mannequin, let go of the exhausting need to be a static noun, and simply allowed yourself to rest in the silent gaps, as a verb? Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. Until next time, keep swimming in the flow.